Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to this Everest Group Indian Live. We'll give some time for our audience to join in. And as we wait, why don't people who are already here tell us in comments where you are joining us from? Right, why don't we get the discussion started? Let's start with a quick introduction. My name is Mayank Maria. I'm a vice president here at Everest Group. I have been with the firm for 7 years now, and I'm from Gurgaon, India. Nishant.
Yeah, thanks, Mayank, and hi everyone. Looking forward to this session. My name is Nishant Udupa. I'm a practice director with Everest Group. Been with the firm for close to 5 years now, and I'm dialing in from Bangalore this morning.
Great. Thanks for that, Nishant. And folks, both of us, we track the engineering services space. That's also called the ER&D space sometimes, right? So I think really up and coming space when it comes to the global services ecosystem, right? A space that deals with commercial products, the engineering and manufacturing of commercial products, right? And all the global sourcing and outsourcing that happens around this space, right? And if you look at this space, the kind of performance this space has given over the last many years, right? It's really been a crown jewel for both the enterprises and for service providers, right? There has been a lot of emphasis on engineering as a function, engineering outsourcing, ER&D, right? Whatever term you may want to use, right? So just to put that in perspective, right, in terms of numbers, I think nearly $1.5 trillion of enterprise spend goes towards this space, right? And that has also been growing at a fairly fast pace, right? At that size, around 5 to 6% growth is what we've seen over the last many years, right? And if you look at the outsourcing front, right, though outsourcing penetration is fairly low, right, just about 5 to 6%, which translates to around $75 billion. But on the outsourcing front as well, this has been the fastest growing market, at around 8 to 9% growth that it has clocked over the last few years, where there have been challenges as well in the market, right? It's been fairly hardy, right? But now, even as this is at the top of the global services ecosystem today in terms of growth and attractiveness, right? This space has also witnessed these slowdowns, right? There have been specific markets and segments that have not performed as well, which has led to stress among both enterprises and service providers, right? Which really also brings us to the topic of discussion today, right? We are going to focus on a particular segment of this market, which has been fairly robust, right? It has really risen in significance given the way the market has played out during the economic slowdown, right? And that's really the APAC market. So, as we go in deeper into this, I'm going to invite Nishant. Nishant, I know you're carrying some analysis around comparing APAC with the rest of the world, right? Why don't you talk us through it?
Yeah, sure, Mayank. And before we get into the topic itself, which is APAC and its relevance to our industry and engineering services, let's maybe start off by looking at the broader macro situation as it stands today, right? I think all of us are aware, and you alluded to this. We are going through a bit of a slowdown, and we may not be in the middle of a recession if we technically look at the definition of a recession. Even countries like Japan, US, all of them have avoided a recession because of some technicalities, right? But I think all of us can agree that we are seeing tepid growth, sluggish growth, and this has been consistent for the past few quarters, right? And in fact, if you look at the forecasts of organizations like the IMF, the situation is unlikely to improve in the near future. We are of course optimistic, but we still have to be conscious of the fact that things may not improve much, right? And there are a number of headwinds we are observing, from geopolitical conflicts in multiple places of the world to supply chain concerns, inflation, financial stress, energy crisis, and so on and so forth, right? But I think what's interesting is, a lot of these factors seem to be very disproportionately impacting the Western world, right? So North America and Europe, whereas countries in the APAC region seem to be showcasing a greater degree of resilience. And that's essentially what this chart indicates as well, right? A quick 2-minute download on this chart. This is essentially the GDP growth rates of various economies. And if you look at North America, which is the green line, and Europe, which is an average of various countries within the EU, and that's essentially the yellow line. These two major economies were somewhere in the middle of the pack in 2021, right? So around 6-7% growth rate, which is where you would expect a mature, developed economy to be. But since then, it's been all downhill. And I think the concern is that if you look at forecasts as well, they're not too great, right? North America is going down even further the next couple of years. Europe has been improving a little bit, but I think if you look at the last couple of quarters or so, things haven't been encouraging, right? By contrast, look at the APAC markets, right? India and China are really leading growth. In fact, the current week is an important one in India. It's, budget time, and I think the government has come out with forecasts of around 6.5-7%, which by their own admission is a fairly conservative number, right? But it's still it's a very healthy estimate. China as well, despite the fact that they're going through a slowdown, numbers are still quite healthy, right? Now, you could maybe argue that both of these markets are emerging markets, developing markets, and will naturally tend to grow faster than the others. But I think if you look at something like a Korea or an Australia, even these two countries are growing faster than North America, US, major economies in Europe, right? Similarly, if you look at countries like Brazil or South Africa in the Western world, which are kind of developing, they are again very similar to where North America, US, and Europe would be, right? So I think net, the message is, APAC is more resilient, right? And this is really the place to be, right? So I think with that macro perspective established, what's really the implication of the, for the engineering and R&D industry? And Mayank, let me invite you in here to sort of share some of your perspectives.
Sure. And let's quickly turn the page on that, right? And, what I tried is I tried and bring some analysis, right, around how the activity has panned out more recently, right? I thought tracking the new GBS center setups, the Global Business Services Center setups, right? Analyzing that would be an interesting thing to do here, right? And the data is in front of all of you, right? If you look at 2023 as a year, right, we saw nearly 273 GBS setups, right, across, and this is across the world, right, not just in APAC, right? Now we very clearly see India has been the hot favorite for GBS setups, right? So it's a fairly sizable number, right? The dark blue pie that you see, right? That's all India. But there is also a very sizable activity in the rest of APAC, right? Which is the pie next to the India pie, right? 15 to 20%, right? So all in all, if you look at APAC, including India, right, we've seen more than 50% of all the GBS setups happening in these geographies, right? And if we leave India out, we've also seen good activity in locations like Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, right? So, that's a good sign actually, right? And in terms of beyond India, how the world is looking at some of these locations, right? That's really a reflection of that. Now, if you look at some of the data on the right, so, just talking about the APAC center setups, right? And what are the focus areas for these setups, right? So enterprises typically tend to have like a multi-area center, right? So if we analyze that, ER&D really trumped all the other areas, right? So out of the 153 setups, more than 60% of the centers had some element of ER&D that they are going to work on, right? So that really spells out the importance that enterprises are laying out, one on APAC and two on ER&D in APAC, right? Now, of course, these centers would be doing a lot of other things, right? And potentially even ER&D would be not just for the domestic markets, right, and the global markets as well, right? But I think there is going to be a lot of focus on domestic market, not domestic market so much, but the APAC markets, right? So if there is an a center which is say set up in Vietnam or Thailand, that is going to cater multiple markets in the APAC geography, right? That's going to be the flavor here, right? Let me also share some more data points, right? So, which verticals are really leading the way in terms of these GBS and engineering center setups in APAC, right? So, we've seen good amount of activity from automotive. We've seen good amount of activity from the high tech sector. Some activity in the industrial products sector as well, right? And most of these centers, they've been set up as COEs focusing on fairly cutting edge themes like AI, ML, and what it means for the engineering world, right? There is focus on other digital technologies as well, right? There could be core domain-centric R&D that they could be focusing on, right? Or cybersecurity as a theme, right? But net, I think there is a good amount of focus on software and digital technologies, right? That's the theme that we've seen play out across most of these announcements that have happened of late, right? And embedded, mechanical, some of the other relevant engineering themes, those have also been witnessed, but to a lesser degree, really, right? So all in all, good amount of activity, right? A lot of centers coming up, meant both for the global markets as well as for the high potential APAC markets that these enterprises are looking to go after.
Yeah, yeah, and just to sort of add to your narrative, and by the way, completely valid points, right? We're seeing so much traction around new centers focused on R&D, and as you rightly said, it's something that cuts across verticals, right? And so many examples come to mind, in the automotive world, and you mentioned automotive. I think Honda very recently, a month or so back, they set up a new R&D center in Bangalore. And automotive, right? Honda has this new focus of transitioning everything to electric vehicles and sustainable
Yeah.
transportation and so on. And I think this center sort of caters to that, right? I think in the healthcare medtech world, we've traditionally always seen the likes of an Abbott or a Medtronic and Philips operating. But I think these people are also now scaling up their centers, right? Philips is expanding in Pune, and I think they want to add some 2,000 new FTEs, right? And I think what's interesting is it's not just very traditional R&D work or back office work that's happening, but it's really cutting edge R&D, right? So Philips wants to do a lot of image guided therapy, precision diagnosis, monitoring, that kind of work, right? It's essentially something that will find resonance across the globe, right? And of course, there are plenty of examples in other geographies as well. Honda does a lot of work in Thailand. Actually, there's a very interesting story about Honda and the work they're doing from Thailand, and maybe we'll get to it, if we have time towards the end. But again, locations like Malaysia, Taiwan, and South Korea are known for semiconductors and so on, right? And of course, as these centers scale up, they also start realizing economies of scale, speed,
Yeah.
efficiency, and almost lead the sharing of best practices across geographies, right? And I think most important here is the fact that all these GBS centers or captive centers, whatever you want to call them, they have so much more power today, right? There is more decentralized decision making that's happening, and I think the implication here is that they are emerging as individual buy centers themselves, right? And
Yeah.
that's the big shift we've started to observe in our industry today.
And that's an interesting one, Nishant. I think there was this GBS organization that we were working with some time back, right?
Yeah.
And they weren't really just working for their parent, right? They actually had a P&L responsibility to grow a certain APAC market, or at
Oh,
least a
wow.
certain product line within the APAC market, right? And that
Yeah.
speaks volumes on what kind of trust the enterprises are placing, the kind of relevance that these centers are starting to have, right?
Yeah.
And I think I expect great things happening for these centers going forward as well, not just in terms of scale, but more such examples where they are taking on very, very significant responsibilities on driving the top line for their enterprises.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think hopefully we've been able to drive the point home here, right? That there has been a lot of activity with APAC centric and ER&D in APAC centric, right? Having done that, Nishant, I think what would be interesting to know also is, what's been the trend over the years, right? If we talk about APAC, engineering in APAC, right? How has it grown over the years, right? Do you want to shed some light on that as well?
Yeah, sure, Mayank. I think we don't need the slide for now. Let's keep it down. I think the good news, Mayank, is just following on from what you said. It's not just the number of centers that are increasing. It's also R&D spend, right? And I think there's a cascading effect, right? Global OEMs or enterprises come in, they do a lot more R&D locally, and then that starts birthing a local industry as well, right? So if for example, go back to what happened in the automotive industry or semiconductors, and in fact even aerospace in China, that's essentially the story, right? You had all these global OEMs coming in, they set up manufacturing in some of these locations, and then eventually they wanted to have engineering closer to manufacturing, so they set up R&D centers. That led to tech transfer, and eventually you had a whole host of these
Yeah,
local firms that came up and started competing, right? So that continues. Now, if we come to ER&D in APAC, and you gave some of those numbers at a global level, which is we're looking at a 1.4, 1.5 trillion dollar market, growing at 5% every year. So it's a huge market, and I think APAC is highly relevant. Right? It's already accounting for close to a third of this global market. Right? So as per our estimates, APAC R&D spending is somewhere around 450 to 500 billion dollars, right? And it's rising faster than the global average. So it's a huge market, right? Now I think let's maybe talk about segmenting this market. And off the top of my head, the simplest way I can think of is segmenting it by maybe geographies and verticals, right? I can maybe start with the geo segmentation, and maybe you can chime in on some of the verticals, right?
sure.
Uh, yeah. Now, on the geo front, I think what's interesting is it's a fairly concentrated market, right? You have China, Japan, and South Korea, which are, I think, they account for almost 80% of the market, right? And then you have the second tier of nations. You have India, you have Taiwan, you have Australia, and so on. And then you have, almost a very long tail, so to speak, right? All the countries in Southeast Asia, multiple smaller countries, and so on, right? So let's maybe start off with China, the elephant in the room, or maybe the dragon in the room. I think they prefer that, right? So clearly the largest market, right? Very opaque as well in some sense, but it's the largest spender across several verticals, right? If you look at automotive, they're the largest EV market. If you look at software products and ISVs, they almost have an equivalent to every major Western tech firm, right? In aerospace, they are building their own commercial airliner today, the Comac. And in high tech, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's electronics, telecom, there's this huge government funding going to players like Huawei and SMIC, and essentially to invest more in R&D, advanced technologically, because a lot of these companies are not just competing with their Western counterparts, they're also competing from a geopolitical angle, right? So I think net it's a huge market, it's a growing market, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, right? The other interesting bit about China, Mayank, is I think the fact that there are two entities today, and these are very, two distinct entities, right? So you've got representation from the global enterprises and OEMs. So, think of a Volkswagen or a BMW or an Apple, Airbus, and so on, and their Chinese presence. And by the way, none of these, folks want to lose out on the market because it's such a huge domestic market, right? So despite all the geopolitics and tariff wars and trade tensions and so on, none of them really want to exit the Chinese market completely, right? So they are essentially going to continue to sort of localize their offerings and continue to invest here. Though I think what we are starting to hear as well is this share or this segment is coming down, and that's essentially because of two reasons. One is we discussed that the Western economies are not doing so well, so that kind of impacts the China play of these entities. And secondly, the Chinese OEMs have started to do really well, and that's the second big segment, right? There's a big category of players across industries that are coming up that are, not just addressing the local market today, the domestic Chinese market, but they're also trying to expand overseas, right? And again, something that we are observing across verticals, right? What's next? I think Japan. Japan
Hey,
actually is,
Nishant, and
yeah,
before we go there, right, on
yeah,
China specifically, I think automotive and consumer electronics would be the verticals, right, where the
yeah.
domestic Chinese enterprises, they are trying to make a big
Mhm.
name for themselves outside of China, right? I think those
Absolutely.
are the top two, right? Yeah.
Those are the top two. I think in aerospace as well, they are trying to develop Comac and so that it competes with Airbus and Boeing. But I think the market there is still largely China, and they want to expand towards Southeast Asia, right? Not so much in North America and Europe. But yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah.
If you look at maybe Japan next, actually Japan is a bit of an outlier, right? The economy is in a decline. It's one of those countries which is in APAC and yet not doing so well in terms of engineering R&D processes, perhaps not as mature as some of the other markets as well, right? And so a lot of the enterprise focus today is on cost optimization and improving efficiencies, right? So that's where a lot of the spend is going today. But I think, if you look at these next set of countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, all of these are very interesting, very distinct markets, right? So Japan is known for, automotive, electronics. In Australia, it's completely different. You're looking at industries like, industrial products and energy and utilities and mining and so on, right? So that's a completely different, set of verticals. And then if you look at Korea, you have semiconductors, you have electronics, telecom, and so on, right? So it's a different set of verticals and markets that each of these nations cater to it. But I think what they've all done very well is expand within APAC, right? So go into places like India and Southeast Asia and essentially localize some of their products for these markets, right? Uh, I think if we look at APAC, we must talk about India. It's really the fastest growing economy in the region. There is so much domestic demand. I think everyone wants a slice of this pie, and there is strong impetus from the government as well, right? In the form of encouraging sustainability and automotive. So think of EVs and batteries and investments in hydrogen. I think medtech and pharma have always been strengths for India. Semiconductor is emerging as well. So I think there's a lot of interest in this market, right? Uh, I think the last, few countries, if you look at the likes of Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, these have really been the beneficiaries of geopolitics, right? I think a lot of R&D and engineering has moved to some of these locations, right? So Malaysia, for example, we are observing a lot of semicon packaging facilities that have been set up here, right? So, and similarly, there are niches that are being catered to by these nations as well. So Mayank, the other way, as I said, to segment this market is by verticals. Can you maybe take some of that up?
Sure. And before I do that, I think Nishant, I also wanted to like summarize my key takeaways, right, from
Yeah.
your narrative around the different countries, right? I think one key takeaway is around India, right? I very clearly see that there are a lot of companies that want to make it big in the APAC market, right? But India is at a lot of times not even on the radar, right? So that's an interesting one. The other one is the whole China plus one play, right? And I think you alluded
Yeah.
to that, right? Countries like Vietnam and Thailand and others benefiting from it, right? Even to an extent, India benefiting from it, right? So, and I believe that momentum is going to continue, right? Companies
Yeah.
cannot get out of China, right? It's such a big domestic market, but they also don't want to over rely on China, right? So
Yeah.
some of that activity and how it plays out in terms of engineering center, manufacturing coming out to nearby countries, that's also going to be an interesting thing to watch out
Yeah.
for. Yeah. Uh,
I think there's
as
a
you said, right?
question, Mayank, I think there's a question, in fact, multiple questions we are receiving from some of our listeners. Let's maybe look at this comment, right? The overcapacity in China is ensuring that EU is in the stage of adding punitive taxes on EV. It's going to hurt them. That's a valid point, Jay, but I'm not sure I completely agree with it, right? So yes, EU is adding punitive taxes. In fact, they've already passed some regulations around this last month, if I remember correctly, right? But if you look at EVs and software-defined vehicles, the Chinese are almost so far ahead of the competition that despite these punitive taxes and trade barriers, they are still poised to expand in the European market. Right. So if you look at OEMs like a BYD or an Xpeng or even Great Wall, some of these names, they are well ahead of the competition. Right. In fact, you look at Volkswagen, BMW, all of them are essentially trying to partner with some of these Chinese OEMs so that they can improve their tech play. Right? So yes, I think some of these punitive taxes will have an impact, but I think the Chinese OEMs are still ahead, right? The story might be different in the US though, right? Because there the geopolitical and geopolitics angle plays out a lot more. But in Europe, I think that's still a fair market for the Chinese OEMs to crack.
Makes
Okay.
sense, Nishant. Yeah. And why don't we move ahead, right?
Yeah.
You did highlight how do we look at different verticals in the APAC market, right? And let me very quickly cover some of that, right? So I think the estimates that we carry, nearly 75% of all the spending within APAC, right? It's fairly concentrated on four verticals really, right? It's automotive, consumer electronics, commercial software, and semiconductors, right? Of course, no points in guessing. Automotive is the biggest one, right? So very quickly, let me talk about it, right? So estimates say nearly 33% of all the R&D that's happening in APAC is being driven by the automotive sector, right? Uh, many countries have a very decent automotive ecosystem, right? We have the big names coming out of Japan and Korea, right? At the same time, China, the OEMs, going beyond China, the way we discussed it, right? And then also India, right? We have OEMs and we also have a fairly big tier one ecosystem in India, right? So all of these are the key countries that are driving the engineering spending in the APAC geography, right? And the global themes, right, which is around connected vehicles, electric vehicles, and now it's getting a bit jumbled, right? There are
Yeah.
commitments more towards hybrid than electric. All of that is playing out, but this is still a very relevant theme, which is moving beyond pure internal combustion engines towards either hybrid or electric. Right? That's driving a lot of spend. We see SDVs, software-defined vehicles now, right, which is playing out across the global geography, but also being adopted by the APAC OEMs and tier ones, right? I think the good thing about the APAC OEMs is that most of those are mass market OEMs, right? And hence the growth has been maintained over the last few years, right? And if the revenue is growing, they also have decent amount of dollars to spend on engineering, and hence the engineering spend has also kind of sustained over the last few years, right? We already talked about the Chinese OEMs like BYD, GD, right? They really being at the leading edge when it comes to, I think, vehicle electronics and vehicle software, right? So them looking to move beyond China means there is a lot of spending happening around localization as well, right? So I think those are some big themes. I think one more thing that I'll add on automotive is the whole manufacturing engineering play, right?
Yeah.
I think these companies are mature in terms of adopting some of the technologies on the manufacturing side as well, right? So that's also driving some of the spend. So that's really a very quick roundup upon the largest vertical here. If we look at the second largest one, which is consumer electronics, and I'll keep my narratives quick here, right? Second largest and the largest have a lot of gap, by the way, right? The second largest vertical, consumer electronics, that only accounts for about 15% of the ER&D that happens in APAC, right? Companies like Samsung, Sony, Panasonic, and then a whole host of companies that are born and grown in China. More recently, some companies that are making their names out of India, right? They are really driving the engineering spending here, right? And I think the focus is on really using newer technologies to drive differentiation in their products, right? The hardware is getting a lot commoditized, right? Of course, there are new features that come in, right? New features and functionality, but that gets commoditized very quickly, right? I think the plays around, say, using AI kind of interfaces can be offered, or
Yeah. Yeah.
personalization can be offered, right? Those kind of things are really playing out when it comes to consumer electronics, right? So net, I think a lot of software-led differentiation that's happening, right? Which also leads us to probably the next vertical that we should very quickly discuss, which is the companies that are actually in the business of building software itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Uh,
yeah, maybe I can jump in here, right, Mike? Because I think software is, I spoke about this earlier, how there are almost Western equivalents of every company within China. And I think, you spoke about AI and Gen AI. I think until a couple of years back, they were competing very closely with, Western firms, companies like Baidu and Tencent and Alibaba. And I think that's gone down a little bit over the last couple of years, right? But it still, remains a huge vertical. I think when it comes to APAC, the key difference between this and the global market is that, it's such a huge consumer market, right? You've got India and China, which are the two most populous nations. Countries in Southeast Asia are so populated, so densely populated. there's a huge end user segment, right? And it's home to the largest number of mobile devices, connected products, and enterprises are essentially investing in developing software products to tap into this consumer tech segment, right? So if you look at India or even Southeast Asia, if you look at, let's say, the startup segment, or even firms that were established, maybe a decade back and have become big now, a lot of them invested in platforms, in software in order to cater to end users, right? And it's not just, VC money or PE money that's flowing in. It's also, money from legacy traditional firms, right? I think a lot of them have realized that, digital or traditional is the way to sort of go forward and engage with some of these users, right? I think the other big difference in the APAC market is semicon, right? Semicon, APAC is really the home of semiconductor manufacturing. And I think techno nationalism is really emerging as a big focus in this region, right? So countries want to diversify away from China and Taiwan. And there are lots of these nations in Southeast Asia, India, Vietnam, and so on, that are actually, investing, or the governments are sort of trying to boost manufacturing within some of these locations, right? I think Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia have really emerged as important nations here.
Yeah.
Malaysia, especially, there are so many OSAT facilities that are being set up, and there's almost a talent war now, going on in the semicon market. But I think, beyond manufacturing as well, there is so much R&D going into, new technologies, whether that's RISC-V, which is the open source standard, or 3D packaging, or even, developing chips for some of the adjacent verticals, right? Whether it's SDVs or 5G, 6G, or even AI, which is really driving growth today.
Yeah. And I think, Nishant, you interestingly touched upon the manufacturing angle, right? And I think we did talk about it here and there, right? But
Yeah,
I think there is a lot of activity which is happening on manufacturing as a horizontal function, right? If we see the top verticals that we discussed here, right?
Mhm.
Three of the four verticals really produce something tangible, right? And most of that production also happens within the APAC geography, right? Could
Yeah,
be away from their R&D centers, but still largely centered around APAC, right? And I personally have seen a lot of activity, right, around themes like predictive maintenance, sustainable manufacturing, right? Companies offering consulting around, how do your manufacturing setups become more sustainable and those kind of things, right?
yeah,
Is there more that you want to add just
yeah.
on the manufacturing aspect that's being out here?
Yeah, so yeah, I think manufacturing is an interesting one, right, Mayank? So, on the one hand, as you rightly pointed, APAC is the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. China plus one initiatives have really led to growth for a lot of countries. But at the same time, if you look at digital manufacturing or Industry 4.0, right, the market hasn't really taken off. Right? And there are multiple reasons, of course. Talent or labor hasn't been as scarce in this part of the world. So, investments in automation will naturally be lower, right? Then you've got the whole cost angle. So cost of production is lower in this part of the world. And therefore, what that has meant is the ROI for some of the digital manufacturing initiatives is, not very apparent. Right? And you spoke about sustainability. If we compare it to the West, I think the focus on sustainability in this market is a bit lower, right? So
Yeah.
that's been holding back growth. Though I would say, that all these three things are changing. Right? If you look at labor costs, they are going up in India, China, everywhere. You need skilled labor to operate some of these semicon fabs that are being set up, right? Cost is a major issue given the economic situation today. And I think governments across the region are slowly acknowledging sustainability as well, right? So there is investment and money going into things like asset monitoring and energy tracking, waste reduction, and so on, right? So I think net digital manufacturing is actually a huge untapped opportunity, in this region.
Yeah. Sure. Hey, Nishant, before we go ahead, I think we have some interesting questions. Why don't we take some of them? I think there is a question from Hiren, right? What is the percentage headcount in GCC, which are their own resources, and how much is typically locally outsourced, right? Uh, Many of them still seem to be having tactical vendor relationships, right? Many of them are still dependent on OEM HQ budgets, right? So let me take the first bit first, right? I think it varies a lot, right? What part of the GCC workforce comes, is their own workforce versus, coming from contracts with some outsourcing partners, right? I think in the setup stage, right, the number seems pretty high, and some of these GCCs tend to maintain that number over time as well. But we've seen others, and this again is a more recent phenomenon. There is an example that comes to my mind around this, right? And this is, I think the company has publicly announced their intent. It's a company called Telstra, right, which is an Australian telecom major, right? They have a lot of GCC presence here in India, right? And till about 2 or 3 years ago, right, nearly 35% of their GCC headcount was probably sourced from outside, right? But there is a very clear and stated intent, and that also points to the fact that they want greater ownership, greater control, right? There is going to be a reduction in that contracted headcount, and the company would likely want to do more of it via their own workforce, right? So, long story short, at the time of setup and scale up, right, the number could go to as high as 30-35%, right? But of late, we are seeing a very intentional move from these GCCs to actually have their own workforce rather than relying on outsourcing partners in a very big way. Some of the other things, right? Vendor relationships being tactical, right? So, see, most of the GCCs today, they manage the vendor relationships in the sense that they are more in the project management role. The decision on what gets outsourced and to whom rests with the HQ. There will be a very few handful of the GCCs which would actually also take the calls on who to outsource to, right? And what work streams, right? Those kind of things, right? Dependence on OEM HQ budgets, right? A lot of it is still there, right? But GCCs are also getting into that, a mindset of building business cases of, what kind of innovation are they driving, what kind of savings are they driving for their HQ, and can some of that, be channelized back into their own investments and innovation, right? But I think those are more mature GCCs. Most of those would still fall in the territories as Hiren indicated.
Yeah. I think, Mayank, there are lots of questions on the outsourcing front as well. I think there's a good sort of time to maybe just give an
Yeah.
overview of what's happening on the outsourcing side as well, right?
Right. So yeah, we are bringing some data around it, and potentially we can have the page up for anchoring this conversation, right? So when we look at APAC, of course, given so much interest from enterprises, right? Naturally, service providers are also following the queue in that sense, right? Service providers have also seen challenges in geographies like North America, to an extent in Europe, right? So they are also looking to double down on APAC as a geography, right? So both factors playing together, APAC is also emerging as a very big outsourcing opportunity, right? So today it's roughly around $9 billion of outsourced engineering spend from the APAC market, right? This is about 15 to 16% of all that is outsourced in the engineering world globally, right? So a fairly sizable number in that sense, right? But I think the interesting thing to note is the growth, right? 8 to 9% growth, and that too in the difficult times of today is what we expect the APAC market to drive, right? Really because of the again both the factors, right? Enterprise interest is rising. They need partners to drive some of their initiatives at scale, right? So some of that will continue, right? In the near future, we expect the growth to even accelerate further to around 10 to 11%, right? Now, what geographies, what verticals, right? So I think geographies like Japan and ANZ, right? They will be at the top of driving this engineering outsourcing momentum, right? Some of the others like Singapore, maybe to an extent. I think China will continue to be a bit of a black box, right? The China
Mhm.
opportunity has to be addressed from within China. The
Yeah.
cost arbitrage is not really huge, right? So some of those challenges will continue to be there. And which verticals really? So automotive and high tech will be the big ones, right? They are the big spenders. They are the more mature outsourcers as well. They've been
Yeah.
outsourcing for a while, so they will be driving that outsourcing momentum as well. Right? So I think one more point, and I did touch upon it earlier. That's on India and India-related outsourcing as well, right? So there are companies within India, right, who of course they can, cost arbitrage is not really the play there, but they are looking for companies that have experience in doing engineering of complex products, right? So even the India market would be substantial. It won't be the largest in the APAC scheme of things, but would still be something worth exploring.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think Mayank, what's so encouraging is the fact that outsourcing in APAC is contrasting so much with the rest of the world, right? A growth of 8 to 9% in a year where the market is at 5, 6, maybe 7%. That's really healthy, and it's an indication of the direction in which we are heading in, right? And I think our forecasts for the medium term also kind of reflect that, right?
Yeah.
So for the audience who are looking at the chart, if you look at the numbers on the right, that's a 3-year forecast that we've given you across geographies. APAC is poised to grow much faster than the rest of the world, right? There is of course a low base effect at play, but even if you consider that growth of 10 to 11% over 3 years is really where you want the industry to be, right? And whereas if you look at North America and Europe, they are somewhere in the mid single digits itself, right? So I think that's kind of indicative of the R&D or R&D outsourcing growth that we are going to see in the region. But Mayank, I think while all these growth numbers are encouraging, I think what would be interesting is if you can also comment on how providers have been reacting to some of this, right? Is there an acknowledgement of this being a real market? And I think that's also ties to some of the questions we are seeing in the live chat as well. Yeah.
So I think acknowledgement is there for sure, right? But has anybody cracked this market or made it big in this market already? The plain and simple answer is no. And the reason is really because most of the companies have only recently started to put like a dedicated focus on this geography, right? Anything before that was more opportunistic, right? Maybe the investment or the focus was not enough, and hence nobody has really made it big. Right? But now that companies are kind of acknowledging this as a big opportunity, we are seeing some big initiatives that are being taken. Right, one I think is placing dedicated leadership for driving the engineering services growth in the APAC market. Right, we've seen quite a few companies do it, and it's mostly seasoned leaders from within the organizations who've kind of proven their mettle elsewhere in another market. Right, they are being moved to lead the APAC charter, right, and not from afar. Right, they are actually mobilizing to the APAC geography as well. Right, so that's there, and it's not just people at an APAC leadership level, right? We are also seeing fairly seasoned leaders who would say come in to lead, as an example, the APAC automotive charter or say the Japan charter within APAC, right? So, in that sense, two layers of leadership is being deployed, right? Which really is a testament of the kind of commitment that providers are looking to, providers are putting on this geography. The second big thing that we are seeing is really delivery expansion, right? Of course, most of the APAC markets can be served from outside, from within India, right? And most of the providers tend to have an India presence, right? Uh, as a testament again to their commitment, they are setting up local delivery presence as well, right? That won't be as scaled, but having some delivery professionals, say, onshore in Japan and in Australia, right? For a country like Japan, it's unique given the cultural sensitivities. It is really required that there is somebody in Japan to even handle the delivery, right? So some of that is happening. But in addition to onshore and India, companies are also looking to scale themselves in locations like Vietnam, could be Malaysia, and more recently even exploring location like Sri Lanka. Right, now, these countries won't offer a lot of scale of ER&D talent, is my belief. Right, but that near-shoring angle, which these can offer, that's something that these providers are looking to back out really.
No, very interesting, Mayank. And I think another thing that we are observing in the market is a lot of acquisition, right? And I think there was a comment as well which was asking about M&A. So we are observing a lot of M&A as well on the provider side, right? And what that is doing is it's really shaking up the engineering services provider landscape, right? Very interestingly, by the way, we are actually coming out with a report called the Engineering Services Top 50, which is essentially a list of the top 50 service providers that are very relevant for the market. We'll have details around revenue growth, the verticals these providers are operating in, and lots of interesting analysis about the market, right? It's scheduled to release soon, so do click the link in the chat, and we'll be happy to send you a copy of the report when it releases, right? But anyways, going back to M&A, that's an interesting one, and I think it was Jay who asked that question, right? We are seeing a lot of M&A. It's essentially the quickest way to build expertise and get a foothold in one of these markets, right? And we've seen plenty of examples, right? Global firms, and I can maybe name some as well. So the likes of Accenture and Capgemini have been acquiring here. We've got European pure plays like an Alten perhaps, and Indian companies as well, trying to expand into Japan and Vietnam and Australia and so on. Right? So I think getting access to some of these unique markets has been a big driver for M&A. And then the second reason is, of course, you want to expand delivery footprint as well, right? So either an acquisition in India so that you get access to low-cost delivery location, or you're closer to your customers, in onshore geographies. And then, of course, you also get access to niche talent, right? So Thailand, for example, has a lot of good automotive engineering talent, right? Malaysia, Singapore, these places are getting known for semiconductor engineering. Right? So you get access to that kind of talent as well. The last thing maybe I can quickly highlight is partnerships, which I think providers are also struggling with this, right? So who should they be partnering with, and what do partners really give them? Is it access benefits, or is it about technology benefits, right? And different markets would again have a different flavor, right? So a Japan would be known for robotics, but Vietnam wouldn't be. Right? Similarly, locations like India and China would have great universities, right? So can you explore collaborations with some of these educational institutes, right? Not just for talent, but really for research on developing and building solutions. And I think a lot of providers can explore some of that as well. Right. So, Mayank, I think we've established the lay of the land fairly comprehensively, right? Now, if we maybe think about closing the discussion, what are your key takeaways in terms of implications for businesses?
Yeah, and before I do that, folks, hopefully the lay of the land is clear, right? We are happy to have follow-up conversations, right? Feel free to reach out. But I think my key takeaways, Nishant, as you asked, right? I think for any global enterprise to be able to cater to APAC successfully, I think my one liner would be in APAC to serve APAC, right? So really serve APAC from within APAC, and that would mean a variety of things, really, right? So simple things like setting up local sales and delivery presence. So sales presence, it's a no-brainer, right? But even onshore delivery presence, right? That'll be important, right? It's similar to how companies have been following the strategy of being in China for China, right? So some of that will have to be enacted for countries like, and more, the culturally sensitive countries like Japan, and potentially to an extent South Korea as well, right? Uh, how do you further do it, right? Find the right partners, especially true for companies who are just entering the APAC market, right? How can you elevate your trust quotient? How can you accelerate your market access, right?
Yeah.
That is through partners who are probably playing in an adjacent industry, and both of you can benefit in some way, right? By uh, you know going after the market together. And the third big takeaway from me is localization of products, right? The context of the APAC markets is very different, right? Different languages, right? Different product features that would be appreciated in these markets, different regulations to go after, and even the spending power of the people in these countries is very different, right? So, how do
Yeah.
you really focus on localizing your products for these markets? That's going to be very, very important to you to succeed.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, Mayank, and I think, all of this applies not just to some of these global OEMs that are looking to expand in APAC, but a lot of APAC-centric OEMs and enterprises as well, right? So even these OEMs and enterprises need to serve APAC from APAC, hire local talent, adapt their offerings to the local market, and so on, right? I think what's going to be critical for some of these players is, can you go beyond your home market and explore the rest of APAC? right? Often, we've heard of so many, enterprises, OEMs looking to crack the West, right? But there's a very strong case to be actually made for enterprises to look at other nations in their vicinity itself, right? And in fact, in a lot of cases, depending on what the product is, you may not even need to localize some of your offerings, right? Just a few minor tweaks or maybe even no tweaks can just, make it ready for that geography. And I think beyond exploring different markets, there are plenty of really strong R&D locations as well that are emerging, right? So you would of course think of India and China, but even locations like Thailand and Vietnam have become, so much more mature today, right? And I think what's interesting is it's not just the fact that these locations are developing products for the local market; they're actually also developing products for the rest of APAC and for the world, right? Mayank, in fact, I think this is a good time to share that Honda story I was speaking about earlier, right? It's a very, very interesting case study, and I know you will probably enjoy it, right? So, if you look at the leading imported vehicle in Japan over the last 2 months, it's the Honda WRV, right? That's their essentially their entry level SUV, right? So imagine that, right? The most imported car in Japan is by a Japanese OEM, right? So very interestingly, Honda did all the R&D and design and development of the car from their Thailand center, right? They then shipped all of that work to India. They finalized the R&D, the design, they sourced a lot of components and they manufactured it in India, right? And then they took it to Japan, right? So a lot of benefits, right? They tested the products in a sizable market. The fact that they did the development, R&D, manufacturing outside Japan meant that they got a lot of cost benefits as well, right? And of course, given that there are so many trade agreements in the region, they could take a lot of advantages of, all these trade agreements, and they didn't really have to pay a lot of import-export duties and so on, right? So just I think goes to show that show the value that R&D from APAC for APAC products is kind of valuable today. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a self-sustaining ecosystem in that sense. Right? You have
yeah,
everything. You have the R&D talent, you have the manufacturing capacity, and you have huge markets as well, right? So in that sense, I think for APAC enterprises specifically, right, tapping into the broader APAC ecosystem, right, it makes
yeah,
absolute sense.
absolutely.
Great. I think Nishant, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. Hopefully the same for you as well as the audience that we have. But before we close, do we have any more questions that you want to take up?
Yeah, let's just quickly go through some of this.
So I think there is one on skill set availability, right? I think we are not carrying that data today, right? But happy to address that offline. Rajeshwara, feel free to touch base with us and we'll be able to have a conversation.
Yeah,
There's another question, right? What are some key things for service providers to consider to expand and grow in APAC? So I think we did talk about some of this in our conversation, right? So we'll take some good investment, right, and that intent to really expand into impact, right? So from having dedicated leadership to expanding your delivery presence, which makes more sense for as a nearshore locations for the impact market, right? To also accelerate your growth and footprint in this market via M&A, right? Some of those things I think are top of my mind thoughts on what service providers should be looking at when it comes to this market. Anything that you want to add, Nishant?
yeah, and very pertinent question. And you're right, by the way, right? Some of the things we spoke about for enterprises and OEMs, I think applies to providers as well. But I think providers need to, I think, realize that they can't sell the same thing to everyone, right? So the needs are different even within the same market, right? So what global OEMs are looking for from providers, let's say in China, is completely different to what local OEMs would want, right? If we think of automotive, the Chinese OEMs are so far ahead from a technology standpoint that they don't need support on that, right? So they need support on optimizing their processes, best practices, establishing SOPs, and helping them crack other markets, right? Whereas the story is, completely opposite for a global OEM that's essentially looking to crack the local market, looking for, technology expertise, understanding of regulations, security, and data considerations, and so on, right? So I think that nature of support and services you're offering to different kinds of entities is going to be very different, right? We spoke about the captive centers and GBS centers. I think that's an interesting opportunity as well for providers, right? How do you leverage the BOT model to help some of these organizations set up their center, right? I think for a lot of these companies that are looking to set up centers, the BOT model is a very interesting one to explore because there's lower initial investment, they don't need a lot of time or even in-house expertise, and eventually you can bring the operations in-house later on, right? I think that these are some of the reasons why this model is becoming so popular, and I think it's a great opportunity for providers to engage with enterprises, build a relationship with them, support them, teach them nuances about the local market, cultures, so on and so forth, right? So I think that's an interesting sort of construct to explore. What else? I think in terms of delivery footprint, you maybe covered most of it, but I would say Southeast Asia is a good place to explore. There was a question on talent. I think that's been one reason, one location rather, that's been relatively unexplored, right? It's a growing market, and in any case, in some of these hyper local markets, your customers will essentially be entities you are anyways engaging with in the rest of APAC, right? So I think these are some good markets to explore, and on the manufacturing front, China plus one, that's the big opportunity, right? I think across supply chain, shop floor optimization, China plus one has really created this new market, right? Across a lot of these Southeast Asian nations, India, and so on. There's this need to create almost separate products and supply chains for China and the rest of the world, right? And I think, Apple is the most common example we keep giving, right? They have a separate supply chain in China for China, and then they are building a presence in in India, in Vietnam, and in Thailand, where they are essentially developing products for the rest of the world, right? So I think these are some of the things I could think of. I think we've covered most of it, right? Anything else we need to talk about, Mayank? Any open questions, maybe?
I think we are good, folks. There are some questions that we were not able to address today, but we will try and get back to you offline and happy to have a conversation. Before we close, I want to remind you there is a research that we're going to come out with, which is on top 50 engineering service providers, right? This, I believe, is the fourth or the fifth edition of this research, right? And it's fairly interesting, right? Feel free to sign up, and as soon as this research is released, you'll get a copy. Yeah. All right, folks. I hope this was useful. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day and evening ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Nice talking to you as always, Mayank.